Chill Team, episode 13. My name is Joe, and today we are finally going to carry on our rules Q&A that we set up on the last episode. This did not mean to take up as much time as it has, and we want to get straight back into battle reports as soon as we can. But the number one, we received so many questions that it was too much for one single episode. And number two, the idea was to get this episode out last week, but before Christmas was the plan. But the whole Christmas weekend was just so hectic and busy that I could not find the time where I normally would to edit these episodes and get this up before Christmas. So I couldn't do it, unfortunately. So this is a new intro that I'm recording for this previously recorded episode that you're about to hear. So this episode was recorded the same time as the last episode was. And yeah, I just wanted to set that up with this new intro because it's been a little bit longer than I anticipated it being, from recording this to you hearing it. So that's that explained. And then next week we are going straight back to battle reports. And not only are we going back to battle reports, but we are going back to the campaign with the Gene Stealer Cult Kill Team, Yorick and the Many Arms taking on the Raven Guard Kill Team, Flavor Town. Probably the most anticipated matchup of our podcast so far, just because it's taken so long to put together. But you heard it here first. Next week, that is when that will be going down. And then we're going to wrap up the campaign. Probably we might do one more match after the next match, and then we'll kind of decide on a winner from that. And that'll be this tester campaign over. And we have quite a lot of plans on how to move forward with this podcast with regards to campaigns and things like that. So we'll get to that in a few weeks. But that was just me kind of setting you up for the next couple of weeks of Chill Team and what to expect. I suppose I probably should have said this already, but if you're listening on YouTube, you can also find us wherever you usually find podcasts on the Chill Team podcast feed. Just search for Chill Team and you'll find us there. And if that happens to be the Apple podcasting app, which for a lot of people it is, we would highly, highly appreciate a 5-star rating and review on there. It helps us out more than you could ever imagine, and we appreciate it greatly. Don't forget as well, you can join us on Twitter and Instagram at Chill Team Pod. You can join our Facebook group, facebook.com/groups/Chill Team Pod. And you can email us, chillteampod@gmail.com. But moving on. And now to get to what we're actually here to talk about, and that is the second rules Q&A. So without further ado, we're going to get straight into it. We're moving on to movement, piling in, and consolidating. We had a lot of questions about this kind of stuff. So here we go. First question was, on your episodes, you allow models to consolidate into within 1 inch of an enemy model. Having read the rules, while it is silent on whether specifically you can consolidate into 1 inch of an enemy model, most other rules specifically state that you cannot get within 1 inch of an enemy model without a charge. Could you explain why it is possible to consolidate into an enemy? This is kind of a simple one and kind of not. So I can't explain why they've built the game like this. I don't know the exact logic behind that. Because you are right in that this is, I believe, piling in and consolidating are the only movements outside of a charge that allow you to get within 1 inch of an enemy model. And the reason is, as you mentioned in the question, the rules are specific about when you cannot move within an inch. So it clearly states in the movement phase that you can only move within an inch of an enemy model if you charge. But it's important to note that that is in the movement phase, and the fight phase is not in the movement phase. Just because a rule is stated in the movement phase doesn't mean it should be applied to all movement. So that's one thing to note. But also, regardless of that, on the actual kind of paragraphs or sentences for piling in and consolidating, it doesn't restrict you. It doesn't mention that you cannot do it. So there's no reason that you shouldn't be able to do it. And to further that even more, this was cleared up in the designer's commentary on the Warhammer community website, where the designers were asked, can you do this? And they simply said, yes, you can. So that clears that up, and that's good enough for us. If it's in the FAQ, if it's in the designer's commentary, that's pretty much the last stamp of approval that you need, I think. Moving on, we have, can you move your model during the pile-in phase if it is already in base-to-base combat with the only model it declared as a charge target? So I'm sure this one kind of actually comes down to individual play groups, what the people you play with are okay with, but I would say no, as you are already as close as possible to the closest enemy unit. If your bases are touching, that's as close as you can physically get, and the pile-in states that you have to end closer. So that would be impossible if you were already in base-to-base contact. But this is one thing I'm going to say is this is where people need to be a little bit more specific about their charging distances. Sometimes it can be to your benefit to not be in base-to-base contact with the target of your charge, as it allows you to maneuver around the model up to 3 inches during the pile-in. As long as you end up closer to the target model, it doesn't matter how you get there. So you can move the full 3 inches around the model if you wanted to. As long as you end closer, then that is a legal pile-in. So you effectively get an extra little 3-inch movement out of that. But a lot of people seem to completely forget that you don't need to be in base-to-base contact when you land a charge. You just need to be within an inch. For example, let's say if you are charging a model and you need a 6 to get within an inch. Your model is staring dead straight at the target. There's nothing in between you. And once again, Reese rolls for the Overwatch, and he gets a bunch of 1s. Obviously doesn't hit, and depending on the game type, you may be trying to move up the board, or you may want to get past this enemy model. That might be the reason why you're going into combat with it. It's because you want to get past it. Now, you roll a 7, which is great, but before you go rushing into base-to-base contact, think about holding back a little. So you still get within 1 inch, but maybe you're 0.8 inches away or something like that, so that when it comes to piling in, assuming there's room, you can use that 3-inch pile-in to maneuver around the target model, ending up further than you would have otherwise been. This could also put you in a better position to consolidate into another enemy model, like the question I just addressed a second ago. So if there's another enemy over the other side of the one that you're targeting, and you want to get as close as possible to that, so that once you're done in this combat, you can consolidate into another one, then you can get round in the best position of that. So that's the kind of thing that people don't really think about. But yeah, I probably went off a little bit on piling in general, but I would say no. If you're in base-to-base contact with a model, you cannot pile in, because it's impossible to end up closer than you already are. Next up, we have, can a model that gets consolidated into, who was previously not a part of a charge move and has not yet attacked this phase, attack? So this one came up on one of our episodes not too long ago, actually, on the, believe it was episode 10, maybe, the Astra Militarum versus Blood Angels episode that we recently did. This came up on that, and this is a pretty rare situation in Kill Team, it seems, because everyone's always... all the models always end up pretty spread out, but we encountered it and we settled as the answer being yes, absolutely, and here's why. So a model does not have to have charged or have been charged to attack in the fight phase. We know that, and we accept that with regards to models that have previously charged or being charged in other rounds. We accept that when we get to the fight phase, even though they didn't do it this turn, they can still fight because they're within an inch of an enemy model. But for some reason, when it comes to this particular situation, people don't think it makes sense. So let's just acknowledge that for a second. A model does not have to have charged or have been charged to attack in the fight phase. During the fight phase, any model that has charged fights first. This is called the Hammer of Wrath section of the fight phase. So all the ones that have charged, they do get to fight first. So there's a benefit there. Once that section is out of the way, we move on to every other model that is eligible to fight. This is called the Fight for Your Lives section of the fight phase. To be eligible to fight during this section, a model needs to be within 1 inch of an enemy model. That's it. That's all. That's the only restriction. There's nothing about it having to be within 1 inch of an enemy model at the start of the phase or anything like that. It simply just has to be within 1 inch of an enemy model in order to start a fight sequence. Models can, however, only fight once per phase. So if your model has already fought during the Hammer of Wrath section, it can't fight again. But now we know that, let's say, for example, during the Fight for Your Lives section, your opponent fights and defeats your model. They then consolidate into within 1 inch of another one of your models that has previously not been involved in this fight phase. It didn't have any enemy models within 1 inch of it at the beginning of the phase. That model is being consolidated into and is now eligible to fight. And the best part is your opponent doesn't get to fight again unless they have some form of tactic that allows them to fight twice. They just have to sit there and take your attacks because your model that was consolidated into now has an enemy model within 1 inch of it. It meets all the requirements it needs to fight. So you just get to kind of slap your opponent around a little bit and they just have to sit there and take it. And that's how consolidating can lead to another fight in the fight phase. So watch out for your opponent doing this, as you are potentially due a free swing at them before the fight phase is over. Next up, we have, if you attempted a multiple model charge and only made it within 1 inch of one of the targets, can you then pile in to get within 1 inch of the other model you declared as a charge target? Okay. Yes, you can technically, but you do also have to end closer to the nearest enemy model at the same time. But this kind of falls into what I was saying earlier. So you still need to end the move closer to the nearest enemy model. So this is where you would have to strategically distance yourself away from the initial target when you land the charge, so that when it comes to piling in, you have space to get closer, to end closer to the nearest enemy model, as well as landing within 1 inch of the model that was your second target. So you can do that. That's a thing that you can do. However, although I've never faced this situation before, I'd be interested to get what everyone thinks on this. The rulebook states that any of the models that you do not land within 1 inch of on your charge move is then considered not to have been charged. So to me, that would say that even if you piled into that model, by the time it gets around to the fight phase, that model was no longer considered a target of the charge because it's already been declared as a model that has not been charged. So although you could pile into it, you couldn't do anything to it. You couldn't fight it, but it could fight you, is what I would say to that. I imagine the purpose of this question was to ask if you could kind of pile into it and treat it as a target still, to which I would say no. But the actual wording of the question was, can you get within 1 inch of it? And to that, I would say yes. So I hope that makes sense. It's specifically because when you read the rules of a charge, it states that for a charge to be successful, you only need to reach up to at least one of the targets of that charge. However, any of the models that are not within 1 inch of your charging model that were selected as a target, they are considered to have not been charged. So to me, that says by the time you get to the fight phase, even if you piled into that model, it's considered to have not been charged. So you're just piling into it as if you were piling into any other model. And that would mean that you could not attack it. That is what I would say to that. So a little bit of a weird question, but I think I took it, I think I answered both kind of ways that it could be taken. But that's one that I would really love to hear everyone's thoughts on. If you could let me know in the comments or in the Facebook group, wherever you're standing on that one. Next up, we have, there are several ways to move out of sequence, typically using tactic cards. Which of these count as that model's move for the turn? The rules state a model can only move once per turn, but the pile in and consolidate rules violate this. Our group tend to treat moving first and attacking first tactics as that model's only move or attack for this turn. Okay, so this is a pretty kind of a pretty complicated one, I guess, but I think I know where you're going with this. So there's one tiny bit of wording in the core manual that I think might fix this query a little bit for you. The rules actually state that a model can only move once during the movement phase. And as the pile in and consolidate kind of motions take place during the fight phase, this doesn't violate that original statement at all. So it doesn't state that you can only move once during the battle round or during the turn. It states during the movement phase. So I think that clears that up. And as for using tactics to move or fight out of sequence, as far as I'm aware, they will state if they are intended to be additional, or their placement in the battle round will indicate that they don't affect the original action, so the original shot or fight or movement. So, for example, if there's a tactic that lets a model move during the shooting phase, well, that would obviously be taken as an additional move for the battle round because the shooting phase comes after the movement phase. So a model could have already moved and then it'll move again with this tactic in the shooting phase. So I'm not saying there's a tactic that actually does that. I have no idea if that tactic exists. I'm just using it for ease of use of an example of a movement being placed somewhere in the battle round outside of the movement phase. But regardless, even if it was, for example, there's some where I think you can move before a battle round starts or at the beginning of a battle round. But because all these things are outside of the movement phase, it should be taken as additional because the only restriction is that you can only move once during the movement phase. So if any of these tactics were happening in the movement phase, then it would probably have to state that it was additional. Otherwise, it would be considered the only move, which is where we come on to the decisive tactics that I think you're talking about moving and attacking first. As for those, all of these tactics take place in their own respective phases. So if you use the decisive move tactic to move first in the movement phase, we know you can only move once in the movement phase. So that move will be your only move for that model unless it was otherwise stated that the move would be additional, which on the standard decisive tactics, it isn't. The same goes for both the decisive strike and the decisive shot tactics for the fighting and shooting phases. So from what you said at the end of your question about your group treating moving first and attacking first tactics as that model's only move or attack for this turn, it sounds like you're doing it perfect. You're doing it right. But there could be variations on this with the faction-specific tactics. So I think the way that I just explained it is a good way to work that out. And I hope that all makes sense. That was quite a complicated one for me to write down, to be honest. But I hope I explained that well for you. Next up, we have, does a model's possible advance cap at its full movement characteristic? For example, if a poxwalker, who normally moves 4 inches, advances and gets a 6, can it only move an additional 4 inches due to its move characteristic only being 4? Okay, so this one caused a bit of debate when we had that little kill team meetup that I was talking about on the last episode with Glass Half Dead and Ashes of the Imperium. So the answer is no, basically. And I don't know how this myth came to be, but it seems to be a thing that a lot of people think about Kill Team. So I saw this a lot on a lot of the earlier Kill Team battle reports that hit YouTube, and I think we even adopted it for a few episodes. But having read the rules on advancing, there is nothing about this whatsoever in the core manual. Any model can advance up to 6 extra inches. It clearly states that to advance, you just roll a d6, you take that number, you add it to your model's movement characteristic for that movement phase, and then the next bit is where people are getting confused, I think, because it says that you can then move your model up to the distance of its movement characteristic. So I think some people are reading that and thinking that it means that the advanced distance can only go up to the original movement characteristic, which isn't what that means at all. You've already added the D6 result onto the movement characteristic for this phase. So the model's movement characteristic has changed for this phase. So if it moved 4 normally, as the Poxwalker in the example did, and you roll a 6, then congratulations, for this phase, your movement characteristic is now 10 inches. So we have that 10-inch movement, and then it says you can move up to that movement characteristic. So it's referring to that new movement characteristic, in this case of 10. So it's basically just telling you that you don't have to move the full 10 inches. That's all that is there for. And I don't think I can blame Games Workshop on this one. It does make sense, and it's pretty simple, but I can see where people were getting confused. I just don't know how else they're supposed to word that. But we got sucked into that as well. We thought that was a thing at first, just from seeing other people do it. But having read the rule book, the core manual, it absolutely isn't. There's nothing about any sort of restriction based on the original movement characteristic of the model. So that's the answer is no, basically. You can advance as normal. Next up, we have a question about terrain. What terrain can you jump over without any penalty to your movement? So some people don't even realize that this is a thing, and there is indeed a threshold size for barriers, and just smaller terrain in general, that you can move over with no vertical penalty to your movement. So under the barriers, gaps, and leap-in paragraph on page 43 of the core manual, it states that a model can leap up a barrier that is 1.5 inches high with no vertical penalty to its movement, and it can also leap completely over a barrier that is no larger than 1.5 inches high and 1.5 inches deep, without having to include the vertical distance when measuring the distance of that movement. So that's something interesting to know, especially on Kill Team, where there's loads of kind of pipes and barriers and things all over the board. If they're 1.5 inches high and 1.5 inches deep, then you're good to go. You can jump straight over it. It does specifically mention it being things like barriers. However, we've played it to mean smaller parts of ruins as well, as long as it is something that they could jump over. I'm not talking about moving just through a ruin. But yeah, it does specifically mention barriers, but I take that to mean any smaller kind of scatter terrain type thing. That's what we use it for anyway. So yeah, I hope that clears that up for you and lets you use some extra movement in any of your upcoming games. Next up, we have a couple of really simple ones, actually. Not really simple that you should have already known them, but really simple for me to answer. I mean, some questions on unit equipment or model equipment. Can an intercessor take an Allspex? I think this is because we have... maybe in Reese's campaign team, I think one of the intercessors has an Allspex. And in the core manual, an Allspex isn't a possible piece of war gear for an intercessor. So it's a valid question. But the answer is yes. This was addressed in the official Kill Team FAQ. They changed the ruling on this and a few other model war gear options. So you can view that on the Warhammer community website. But the answer is yes. An intercessor can take an Allspex. Next up, we have, do flayed ones count as having two weapons since they basically have claws on both hands? I mean, this is... I don't know the official ruling on this one, in all honesty, but I would say no, as the Flayer claws are listed under one single weapon profile. If it were considered to have separate weapons, it would state that the model has, for example, two sets of Flayer claws on the profile, but it doesn't. If you look at the Flayed Ones data sheet, it just says that it has Flayer claws, and Flayer claws are one single weapon profile. So I would say, unfortunately, no, that counts as a single weapon. And that basically wraps up the rules questions that we had. We did have a couple of extra questions outside of rules that came in that I just wanted to address as well, though. That is, first up, have you tried a multiplayer game? Just wondering how the podcasting format would work with that. We have, but not in the podcasting setting. So we've only tried it once, and it actually wasn't all Chill Team players. It was me with my Death Guard, Reese with his Raven Guard, and Dan from Ashes of the Imperium, who I mentioned in the last episode, with his Necrons. And the game also got called short, unfortunately, due to time, so we didn't actually get to properly finish it. I believe at the end of Battle Round 2, I was winning, but that was just because I managed to sit on a bunch of objectives in my deployment, and we hadn't got far enough for them to shoot me off of them yet. But yeah, that's my only experience in a 3 or 4 player game. I imagine it would still work for a podcast, and we do want to do it, but the podcast would probably be longer than normal. And the only other problem with podcasting like it is fitting everything onto the table, like physically. Currently, for a little peek behind the curtain for you, all the podcasting equipment and the microphones takes up our entire table that we use, with just one Kill Team board in the center of it. So if we had to double up on the Kill Team board, and more equipment because of more microphones and stuff, I don't think it'd all fit physically on the table, but we are working on giving it a go. You might have heard a couple of episodes ago, we recorded in the studio that my other podcast records in, and that table is much bigger. So that may be a possibility. It is something that we want to try. It's just about getting it sorted, I suppose, and seeing how well we could make it work. But it's definitely something we want to do on the podcast. Ideally with all 4 of us would be nice. But I don't know how hectic that'd be to listen to. But it's definitely something we want to try. We're going to give it a go in the future. We just got to work out how to do it properly. And next up, we have, which other podcasts related to 40k/Warhammer would you recommend? Either that, or can you make 8 hours of content a day? We struggle with an hour a week, to be honest. So I think 8 hours a day might be out the window for now. But with regards to other podcasts, I definitely recommend Independent Characters, although they only release roughly 1 episode a month, I think, because they all have other stuff that they do. But it's normally a long episode, and they're really interesting. They seem to have a lot of history with the game. They have a hobby progress section, which is really interesting, and gets me, like, if I'm on a long drive and I'm listening to that, it gets me super hyped about getting home and painting something. So that is definitely a good one to check out. That is Independent Characters. Also, Ashes of the Imperium, I've already mentioned. That's another really good one. There's also the 40K podcast, which I just recently got into after finding them on Instagram. That's simply just called the 40K podcast. It's nice and easy to find. Also on YouTube, there's plenty of great content from Glass Half Dead, Frontline Gaming, Warp Charged Gaming, Tabletop Tactics, who I'm sure you're probably already aware of. The 40K Couple Show is really cool as well. So there's a bunch of extra content to fill your day. I know the YouTube stuff doesn't really help with listening while you're working. That's kind of why we started this podcast, to be honest, because a lot of the battle reports on YouTube, you kind of need your eyes. you need to be watching what they're doing, because they're not obviously as vocal about what's going on. But independent characters, Ashes of the Imperium, 40K podcast. There's Lorehammer as well. Lorehammer's really cool to listen to. So there's plenty out there to fill your day until we reach that 8 hours of content a day mark one day. Outside of Warhammer, though, if I could recommend a few podcasts, Not Another D&D podcast is great, even if you're not big into D&D, or if you know nothing about it at all. It's hilarious, and one of the guys playing has never really played much before either, so it's basically suitable for people of all levels of knowledge of D&D to listen to, and it's hilarious. So I'd highly recommend that. Also, for a quick plug, I'm personally on another podcast that I mentioned earlier called Never Heard. It's nothing to do with gaming. It's about music. But if that's your kind of thing that you might be interested in listening to, then if you can put up with more of me, you can find me on there at the Close to Home podcast feed and YouTube channel. We borrow all the equipment from that podcast to record Chill Team too. So without that podcast, this one wouldn't really exist. So I feel like it deserves a shout out. What else is there? There's tons of good podcasts out there, but I think I've rattled off all the kind of gaming and RPG type ones I listen to. There has to be. Oh, I'll tell you what is really good as well. If you're a bit of a movie nerd, there's a podcast called The Cinephiles, which I know there's like a million movie podcasts out there in the world. But the Cinephiles is pure movie nerd podcast. Like they break down classic films, and when I say classic, don't get too scared. They class a classic film as anything over 10 years old, and they take them and they break them down like scene for scene, dialogue for dialogue, proper go through it, get super nerdy about it. That's something that I like to listen to as well in my spare time. So tons of podcasts there for you to listen to. Obviously, still prioritize us, please. Even though I'm pointing you towards all this other content, please still do listen to us every week. And that rounds up all the questions that we had. That is everything. So that rounds off our 2-part rules Q&A. Thank you so much to everyone who submitted questions. Also, thank you to everyone in the Chill Team Facebook group, everyone who commented on Instagram, Twitter, all the emails, and also everyone in the Warhammer 40K Kill Teams Facebook group. I'll put a link to that in the description. We had some suggestions of rules to cover from there as well, which was really nice. Everyone on the Kill Team Reddit too, that whole community has been so nice to us, and not downvoting me when I post the links and things like that. So, and I know a few people who are listening to this have come over from there, so thank you for giving us a chance. And with that, we're going to call the episode there. We're going to get back to battle reports as soon as we can, because the next episode that you hear will indeed be the Genestealer Cult versus the Raven Guard. Yorick and the Many Arms returning to take on Flavortown. I know you guys have been looking forward to it. I'm looking forward to it. I can't wait. That'll be up next week. And then after that, we will kind of sort out a campaign winner, and then we'll set off on some plans for 2019, I think. So you can find us at Chill Team Pod on Twitter and Instagram. You can join our Facebook group, facebook.com/groups/chillteampod. You can email us, chillteampod@gmail.com. And with that, I'll see you next week when the Gene Stealers take on the Raven Guard.